All right, when you look at your kids, do you see potential for greatness or do you see something else? You know, God gave you those kids, and your responsibility is to do the best that you can to develop them into their greatest potential. Sometimes we see greatness where there isn't potential for greatness. And does your ego somehow get involved with your parenting style? If you're not a parent this morning, I don't want you to listen to this message as it's for somebody else. I want you to see the real road to greatness. Greatness may not be what you think it is, and so I'm hoping this morning to kind of debunk the world's view of what greatness is, and we're going to approach that in the scriptures this morning. We welcome you to Grace Church San Diego. It's good to have you here. Those of you online, we're glad to have you with us. By the way, those of you who are here in the auditorium, could you give a hand to the people that are online with us today? Would you give them a hand? Yeah. People are looking around. Where are they? Well, we have a growing online campus. I don't know what that means about us here, but they don't want to be with us, but they want to listen to us. So I thought we'd give them a good hand there. If you got away without a Bible this morning, you need a Bible, just raise your hand. Our ushers have a Bible you can use during the service. And when you get that Bible, if you have your Bible, turn to Matthew chapter 20. Matthew chapter 20, because I want to share a story about a mother and her desire for greatness in her children. Every one of us sees potential. We're ambitious parents, aren't we? We want our kids to be maybe better than we were. You look at your kids, and do you really see potential? Or do you see something else? Well, I want to share with you that every child that you have and every person in this room has the potential for greatness. And you say, wait a minute, I don't have extreme charisma. I don't like to be seen. How am I going to get greatness? Well, you're going to have to understand the biblical concept of greatness. I have a friend, actually he's a family member, and he's a name dropper. You ever meet a name dropper? It's like they want to be great. They don't have the potential themselves, so they get to know somebody who's great, and then they talk about knowing that person all the time. And it's really annoying because there's this one guy that this friend of ours, our family member of ours, thinks is really great, so he always drops his name. We think he's a loser, but this guy is really well known, and so he assumes by mentioning his name, we'll be impressed. We actually think it's pathetic. So if you're a name dropper, to try to ride the coattails of somebody who, quote, is great, it's really pathetic. I just want you to know that. That is not greatness. And so I want to talk about how real greatness is achieved, and you might be surprised what God has to say about it. There are assumptions we have for greatness. Let me give you three. The first one is this, that the assumption is, I will be happy if I'm great in the eyes of other people. The second assumption is this: I will only be great if I have recognition and I have power and position. The third one, and most tragic, is that assumption about greatness is that service is insignificant. It doesn't matter. Serving doesn't matter. There's nothing great about serving. Well, you might be surprised at what Scripture has to say about this. Albert Schweitzer said this: I don't know what your destiny will be, but one thing I know, the only ones among you who will be really happy are those who have sought and found how to serve. Service, according to Albert Schweitzer, was the real key to greatness. There's a man named Paul Young. He's the author of the book, The Shack. And if you've been through horrible tragedy, I really recommend you read this, the book, The Shack. And he said this: relationships are never about power, and one may avoid the will to power, and the way to do that is to choose to limit oneself to service. Service is a key to greatness, and what every parent should know about greatness, you need to understand several things. The first one is this. Number one is that your child's need to be first is a natural but unhealthy instinct. Everyone wants to be first. Do you remember Adam and Eve had two children? They had many children, but their first children, Cain and Abel, one gave a sacrifice that was pleasing to God, and the other gave a sacrifice that was not pleasing to God. And the jealousy was so great that the one brother killed his brother over jealousy because he wanted to be first. He wanted to be best. This instinct is within every one of us, a desire to be first. It may be instinctual, but it is unhealthy. The second thing that you should understand, every parent should understand, your child's ambition is the enemy of greatness. Ambition toward greatness is actually the way in which we fail to meet greatness. And then the third thing is this: your child's pursuit of greatness is the road to misery. And I'll tell you this, the pursuit of greatness is never obtained. It is an unattainable goal. The moment you think you've arrived at greatness, there is someone else who is greater. There is someone else who achieves more than you. You see, the problem is that it is a hunger that cannot be fed. And I want to help you parents to help your children not to pursue greatness from the world's perspective. And if you are in the pursuit of greatness, whether it's in your job or whether it's in public prestige or whatever it is that's driving you, you need to really stop and evaluate, why do I want to be great? And can I attain to that level of greatness that will satisfy? Parents who seek greatness for their children. In Matthew chapter 20, I asked you to turn there. If you haven't yet, please turn to Matthew chapter 20. I want to share the story of a woman who believed that she had a right to ask Jesus for greatness for her sons. The problem may have been in her own ego. Let me show you what I mean. Here it says in Matthew chapter 20, verse 20, it says, "Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came up to him," that's up to Jesus, "with her sons, and kneeling before him, she asked him for something." Now, there's another passage in Mark. It records another event or the same event, we're not sure. But in that recording, it says that the sons came to Jesus and leaves out their mother. But in either case, they were certainly complicit with their request to ask Jesus to be great. And this mother, you should understand, when it refers to this mother, the wife of Zebedee, the mother of these two sons, they were James and John. She actually, Salome, is the sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And so, in fact, she was Jesus' aunt. And James and John, the one she's requesting for, are his cousins. And I think that gave her a sense that she had a right to ask for this position that she's about to ask, and we'll get into it in a moment. But there's another thing about James and John. If you've studied the Gospels, you understand something. Jesus had a lot of people that followed him called disciples, but he had 12 primary disciples, one of which was Judas. Didn't work out so well. And, we have several people on our staff, and we're looking for the Judas to get rid of. But and I think we know who he is or she is. But there are some that are more important than others. And Jesus took 3 guys and gave them special attention. He spent most time with James, John, and Peter. Some have said, well, that inner circle included Andrew, which was Peter's brother. He was one of the disciples, one of the 12 insiders. But really we see several times, like the Mount of Transfiguration, an incredible story in Matthew where these 3 were taken to the mount and Jesus favored them in a certain way. This is unfair. You should understand something. Life is not fair. God is always just, but he's not always fair. And if you're looking for fairness in life, you're going to be miserable. Well, these guys were favored by Jesus. Peter, James, and John. James and John, his cousins, were put in that inner circle and given special attention. And they were favored by Jesus in such a way that they began to think maybe we'll be the guys that are key to being great in the kingdom of God. And so here's the request. She said, and he said to her, "What do you want?" She said to him, "Say that these two sons of mine," that's James and John, "are to sit one at your right hand and the other at your left in your kingdom." These in Jewish culture would be the great places of honor. Can you imagine a king having sitting next to him his best and his next to best? These are the two of the greatest. And all that Salome wants is for her sons to be great. Every parent wants sons that are great. Let me tell you, the three perceived notions about greatness. And we see this wherever we go in society. They all start with P, the three P's of greatness. Number one, position. Number two, power. And number three, prestige. If you could just obtain power, position, and prestige, you could be impressive. You could really be somebody. You could have impact. You could be the person that is adored. Those things are a trap. Position, prestige, and power. They don't lead to greatness, and they aren't greatness. There's always somebody with a greater position than you. Salome wanted the greatness of her sons to be seen. Well, the passage goes on. I'll read it for you. Jesus answered in verse 22, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink?" So he turns to James and John, and he says, "Are you able to drink the cup that I'm to drink?" He's talking about the cup of crucifixion and literally talking about dying. And they said to him, "We are able." He said to them, "You will drink my cup. You will die for me, but to sit at my right hand and on my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." And when the 10 heard this, so the other 10 guys are listening to this, they were indignant at the two brothers. There's an interesting thing about the pursuit of greatness. It creates jealousy. You want your kids to be great? What you're going to do is find that if they obtain a level of greatness, people will look at them, yes, with some kind of prestige, but there will be jealousy. This is not what you want for your kids. You want true greatness for your children. Look at verse 25. In verse 25, Jesus called them to him and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles," so he gathers all 12, and he said, "You know the rulers of the Gentiles," probably referring, by the way, to the Roman soldiers and the Roman regime. The word Gentiles here is often used for non-Jews and sometimes for people who were not followers of Jesus. But I think it's used here in reference to the Roman rule. You remember, the Jews were under Roman occupation, and the Romans treated the Jews horribly. And they oppressed them. They overtaxed them. They were abusive to them. They didn't respect their religious beliefs, and they treated them poorly. And he said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles, two things, lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them." Two things. The first one is that they lord it over them. This term, this phrasing, actually means to have an attitude of superiority. The Romans looked down on the Jews. But the second one is a little more insidious. It says that they exercised authority over them. The first one has to do with an attitude of superiority, but the second statement has to do with action. It had to do with the action of control. There's nothing worse than somebody else taking away your liberty, your freedom, and controlling your life. I don't like to be controlled. Every time I'm on the freeway, I think somebody's trying to control me. And it's not the police officers looking at my speed. I'm okay with that. It's the people that drive too slowly in front of me. They are lording it over me and exercising control over my life, and I'm about to make them great. Well, okay, let's just leave that alone. And I was thinking about this. What is the process of becoming great? Has anybody parasailed here? Raise your hand if you've been parasailing. That is like an awesome thing. I would love to be able to fly. How many people would love to be able to fly? I don't mean in a plane. I mean literally just like, bam, fly. I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking, there's something about that would be so cool, because I would be above you. I would love to be able to fly. I've tried. I can't even jump that high. I'm afraid to jump. I used to be able to jump off this stage. I'm getting too old for that nonsense. So there's something called gravity. Well, a few years ago, we had saved up for a vacation for our family, and we decided to go on a cruise. We were going to go to Hawaii. Well, we couldn't afford that, so we went on a cheap Carnival cruise. Did I mention the word cheap? Yeah. Well, anyway, we went on this cruise, and we ended up down in Cabo, and we disembarked from the ship, and we went into Cabo and spent way too much on food. And then we decided, you know what we're going to do? We're going to go parasailing. They have parasailing out there. And so we went out on a boat, and we went parasailing. And I went up with Gracie, our youngest. And everybody got a shot at that. And the neat thing about it is you get on the back of the boat, and the boat's riding along, and you're on a platform. You get in a harness, and it's hooked up to this parachute. And the faster you go, the wind starts to fill up that parachute. And before you know it, you're lifting off of that platform. And I'm there with Gracie, and I saw her eyes just got really big. I think she was only about 8 years old or 9 years old at the time, maybe even younger. And I'm thinking, this is a scary thing for her. And of course, I wet my pants. But beside that, and you just lift off and you begin to go higher and higher. And it's just an awesome feeling. Now, you're not in control. There is the boat that's in control and the wind that's filling that parachute. But that's how greatness works. Greatness is not something you can do under your own power. Greatness is by the power of someone else. And God, what he does, listen to this process of greatness. If you want to be great, you need to hear this. He says, humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, and he will exalt you in due time. You don't exalt yourself. It is something tragic when someone feels that they have to exalt themselves. In fact, it's pitiful as we watch people drawing attention to their greatness. Have you known someone who's really great and they never talk about themselves? People who are not great are always trying to pretend they are. Well, real greatness doesn't come from your power, but it's when that supernatural power overtakes and lifts you up. So how does that work out? In verse 26, he says, it shall be so among you. It shall not be so among you. Not where, like the Gentiles, the Roman rulers lord it over you and exercise authority over you and have an attitude of superiority and action of control. But that will not be among you. But whoever would be great among you, if you really want to be great, the word great is the word megas. If you want to be huge, if you want to be great in the kingdom of God, you must be a servant. So think about this. According to Jesus, the road to greatness is service. Whereas the world says, in order to be great, you have to have position, power, and prestige. What does it take to be a servant? 3 things: humility, love, and sacrifice. Let me ask you something. When you look at your kids, parents, do you see the potential for love, humility, and sacrifice? Every one of your kids has that. I don't care whether they're high functioning or low functioning, whether they are great in their charisma, they've got great personalities, or they're great in academics, or they have the ability to persuade other people. Listen, greatness is not found in accomplishment. Greatness is found in the humility and love and sacrifice of service. So we have a man in this church. His name is Bob. I always use a fictitious name, Bob. Whenever we have a Bob, is your name Bob? Raise your hand. You are loved by me. That's my favorite name. Anyway, Bob. Bob is a guy who has 3 primary talents that I know about. One is He is an accomplished leader. He's been in the church for a long time. He's very influential. He is a guy that surfaces to the top. He is one of those guys that immediately becomes a leader. The second thing that he has that I think is amazing is he has a great skill at teaching. He is a reader, he is a student, and he imparts information in a very powerful and persuasive way. Another thing is he's a musician. And usually he's not up front, but he's usually standing up here or over here, and he plays different instruments. And one of the instruments that he didn't play when he came here, Matt encouraged him to learn a different instrument, and he learned it, and he's really good at it. And those three things, teaching and leadership skills and musical skill, kind of draw attention to him. But I don't want to honor him for that. I want to honor him for something that he and his wife, Bob and Lisa, on Saturday mornings, which you probably know nothing about. On Saturday mornings, they come to work alongside Project Reach, our outreach ministry here in North Park, and they do a thing we call Feeding San Diego. And sometimes I drive up on Saturday, and here they are with homeless people who are struggling with drug and alcohol problems, and people who have mental illness, and others that are just on bad times, single parents and so forth, who need financial help, and they need food and clothes and toiletries. And they just spend time not just distributing these things, but Bob and Lisa spend time talking to these people and loving on them and praying for them. Now, I choose them, but I got to tell you, there are hundreds of people in this church. Do you know that we have over 2,000 people that call Grace Church San Diego their home? And you're among some of the most wonderful people in San Diego. And I'm just so proud of our church because every week, hundreds of people commit, literally, I'm not exaggerating, thousands of hours to make this ministry function. Whether it's in kids ministries or connect groups, or whether it's in our worship and technology and in bands and teaching and all of the things that go into ministry, facilities, all of those things. Our Saturday serve group, our men's group that come and work on the facility, all of these thousands of hours every week to make this ministry go. Some of those get attention. I get attention for what I do. Others get attention for what they do, but the great warriors, the great among us, are the people who are unrecognized servants. And that's what Jesus said. That's where greatness is. You see, a pursuit of greatness in position, power, and prestige is a never-ending desire for something you cannot obtain. But understand this. Serving is not the road to greatness, it is the action of greatness. It doesn't take you to greatness. That's the moment of greatness. When you serve selflessly, sacrificially, out of love and out of humility, when you meet the needs of others in a selfless act, you are great at that very moment. That's where greatness is. We just finished a whole series of videos that our creative team put together called Blueprint for Service. And every time you touch someone in the name of Jesus, you leave a blueprint on them. You touch them with greatness. Maybe nobody notices. In fact, better if no one notices. Jesus said, that's where greatness is. Greatness is found in humility, love, and sacrifice. Is that what you want for your kids? Or does your ego demand something else that they become great in another way? Well, look at verse 27. Not only did he say you will need to be a servant in order to be great, he takes it up a notch and he says, and whoever would be first. So who's going to be the first? Who's going to be, not just who's going to be great, but who's going to be first among you? You must be your slave. So you must be the slave among servants. The first one, servant, is the Greek word diakonos. It just means an unpaid servant, someone who just serves. But this word slave is an interesting word because don't think in our culture about how we pursue or perceive slavery. I want you to get it in the original meaning of the word slave. Now, Jesus was speaking in Aramaic, but when Matthew recorded his Aramaic words, he put it in Greek. And the Koine Greek has this word for slave. There are other words that could be used for slave, but it's the word doulos. Doulos is an interesting word because in Jewish culture, and even under Mosaic law, they had two kinds of slaves. There was a slave that was an indentured slave. It was somebody that owed money to an individual and they couldn't pay it back. And so what they had to do was they became the slave until the money was paid back. That's an indentured slave. And they actually lost their rights. And they had to serve that master until their debt was paid. But what happened oftentimes was the master was benevolent. And he really cared about this, quote, slave, this indentured slave. And there was a relationship that developed between the slave and the master. In fact, the slave oftentimes felt deep love and a kindred spirit for his master. And the money was all paid. And after it was paid, he would go to the master and say, you know what? You are not only a kind master, but you're like a father to me or like a big brother to me. You're like a friend to me, and I love you. And I want to give my life to you. And what was once an indentured slave against the will of the slave now became a doulos, a bondservant. And the way it worked was this. They would literally, under the Mosaic law, they would go to the court and they would ask the judge to make a judgment. And the judgment was this, that the master would take this slave who by his own will decided he would become a slave, a bondservant, a bondman, a free slave to this master for the rest of his life. So here's how they did it. They took him. The judge would order that they would take this slave. The master would take him up to the doorpost, and he would take an awl. You know what an awl is? An awl is a spike. And he would put the spike to the ear, the top of the ear, not down on the lobe, but the top of the ear. And he would take that spike and put that slave to the doorpost. This sounds fun, doesn't it? And he would pierce through that ear. Some of you have piercing. I see them. Ow, ow. I have a couple of tattoos, and man, for me to sit there for an hour to get that done, I'm like, ow, 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 ow. But you have these big holes in your body. And I'm like, wow, you're really committed. But this slave forever was marked with the awl of his master, and he became a doulos. Jesus said, you want to be great? Be a servant. If you want to be first among all the servants, become a doulos. Commit your life. So he notches it up. Greatness is found in service, and being first is found in giving your life away to the needs of others by your will, not against your will. So I thought, let me pull this together for parents. And if you're not a parent, I want you to think about this for yourself. 5 things that parents can do to develop great kids. You can't make your kids smart. You can't make your kids better, but you can create greatness. The first thing is the word heroes. What you need to do is read stories about people who have sacrificed their lives. You know, one of the most well-known is Mother Teresa. There are many that are giving their life away, most of which we've never heard of. There's a man I know in this community. He was a pastor of a relatively small church. Most of you have never heard of him, but he pastored that church up until he could pastor no longer because of age. I think he was there 50 or 60 years in, I think it's called Mission Valley Chapel. His name is Jim Mader. Jim Mader is one of my heroes. Jim Mader was one of those men who spent his life in humility serving others. He is truly a great man. One time he asked me, I was pastoring this church for about 3 or 4 years, many years ago, and he said, he was my prayer partner, and we'd meet once a week, and I said, hey, I've gotten this offer at this church. And he said, well, tell me about the church. And the church was an impressive mega church and with thousands of people every week. And he said, what draws you to that? And I started to give him some, excuse the expression, BS. And he saw through that and he said, look, Tim, what really draws you to that? And I said, achievement. He said, do you think you're worthy for that? And then he got to the core of the problem. It was my ego. And he said, do you feel that God has released you from then called Scott Memorial, now called Grace Church San Diego? And I said, no. And he said, then you're going to disobey God for your desire to be great. So I never prayed with Jim again. I found a prayer partner who had a bigger ego, and he bought in. And I was so humbled by his pure love for God. And I made a commitment in that day that I will commit my life to Grace Church San Diego and stay here as long as God keeps me here. Now, I love it here. Some of you would like me to go find something great, but I'm still here. I got to tell you something. It is very difficult to celebrate as heroes people who are humble, loving, sacrificial servants, because the world doesn't esteem it very highly. But we in the kingdom of God, that's the best. Jesus said, if you want to be great, be a servant. If you want to be the first among servants, if you want to be the best, then be a slave. The second thing that you can do as a parent is model. And what I mean by that is show your kids the value of serving by modeling service. Let them see you serving. Let them see you doing things that would seem beneath you. Sometimes position tells us, I shouldn't have to do that. Well, maybe you shouldn't have to do it, but why not do it? I would like to say, somebody said, Tim, I'm pretty impressed that you like to set up the chairs in the auditorium. And they go, you have a servant's heart. And I wanted to receive that accolade as a form of greatness, but the reality is I'm a control freak, and I can't stand the way everybody sets up chairs. Right now, some of you are off, and I'm just bugged. And after you leave, and before we get to the next service, I'm going to fix these chairs because I got control issues, and it's not about great. All right, enough. So I'm not talking about issues of control. I'm talking about letting go of control, humbly serving others, sacrificially giving of your time and your talents and your treasures to help people that could not otherwise be helped. Jesus said, that's great. That's real greatness. The third thing is to bring opportunities to your kids. What I mean by that is create opportunities for your kids to serve. So look in your neighborhood or in your sphere of influence or in your world, however big or small it is, and look for people who have needs and teach your children the power of service and the greatness of service by giving. And if you can do it in such a way that it's unknown by anyone and even possibly by the person you're meeting the needs. This is a powerful way to demonstrate greatness. When you give of yourself in a way that no one knows, no one gives accolades, no one says, great job. God is watching, and he's saying, this is the creator of the universe, created every one of us, our life, our breath is sustained by God. And he goes, son, you're great. Now, would you rather have some simpleton among us calling you great, or would you rather have God calling you great? Teach your children the road to greatness is through service. The next thing is that you can celebrate. And what I mean by that is when your kids serve, celebrate their accomplishments. We celebrate so much. Our kids do really well. Some of our kids, all of our kids do well in school, and we're proud of them, and some are better than the others. We have one who is pretty smart. A few years ago, I realized he's much smarter than me. And so I'm asking him to go to another church so he's not so critical of my grammar and so forth. But anyway, he's smartest. And when I have a question about history or I have a question about something I can't remember, I'll go, hey, I won't say his name, but I'll say, hey, son, what was this? And he always has the answer. And if he doesn't have it, it takes him about a second. He goes, oh, yeah, here's the answer. In 1942, I'm like, what happened? This kid he's smart. He's ugly, but he's smart. And I see tremendous potential in him. And yet, if I were to say, you're great because you're smart, or you're great because you're funny, and he is, or you're great because you're in good shape, if I only give accolades for achievement, then I teach him the wrong thing. As a parent, I have to say to my son, I have to say, look, when you went out of your way to do this for your sister or you did this for your brother, it's an amazing thing. The other day, the smart one made breakfast for his sister, and I said, well, how was he? He goes, I don't know. I didn't eat it. I go, wait a minute. You made breakfast for your sister and you didn't even eat it yourself? Are you stupid? No. That you celebrate. That's greatness. Do you understand? As parents, we need to teach our children the value of real greatness. And then finally is the word require. We need to require, whether it's spelled right or not. We need to require, don't do everything for your children. Require that they serve around the house. The temptation is to bail your kids out. They leave their stuff around the house, make sure they clean it up. They leave their dishes somewhere, make sure they rinse off their dishes and clean them quite well before they put them in the dishwasher. Teach your children the value of service, the menial tasks that seem beneath us all, that they don't matter. Teach your children and celebrate those. Bailing out your kids from their responsibilities will teach them that they can pursue things that bring attention to themselves instead of things that are important and responsible. Give your kids chores and hold them accountable. I wish I was better at that. Matthew 20 gives this real clear teaching by Jesus about greatness, but he sums it up by giving an illustration of greatness. Before I look at it, let me just share this with you. Can you imagine the greatest being ever to live? Who is the greatest being ever to live? Actually, this greatest being that ever lived didn't exist, has always existed in eternity and will always exist in eternity future. This person created everything, the universe and all that is. This person, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, is truly God who created all things. The Father planned it and Jesus executed it according to Colossians chapter 1. He spoke into existence these worlds. And that very same Jesus, out of humility, out of love, and out of sacrifice, gave of himself for the needs of people that had animosity toward him, who were his enemies. While we were his enemies, he loved us so much that he sacrificed for us. Look what Jesus says about himself. He says, even the Son of Man, which is a reference to his human experience, came not to be served, but to serve. Jesus is saying, I didn't come to be served. I came to serve. That's why he washed the feet of the disciples, which is unheard of for Rabboni, a leader, a teacher. Why would he do that? He wanted to teach them the power of greatness, real greatness. And then it says, and he came to give his life as a ransom for many. We know the word ransom means to give a price that was paid for someone held in bondage. Slaves that were held in bondage. The word ransom was used to pay the price of a slave. So if you were an indentured slave and another person paid for your freedom. That's called a ransom. That's exactly what Jesus did. You see, every one of us is a sinner, and we are in bondage to sin. And God loved us so much, he sent his own son, that if you'll simply believe in him, you will never perish but have everlasting life. He gave his life as a ransom for us who didn't deserve it, for every one of us. So how do we get that ransom to be our possession? By simply believing, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him will never perish but have everlasting life, because he's the ransom. He's the price that was paid. Would you bow your head?